Hello there and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. Normally I come to you with a really practical episode about how to grow plants hydroponically. Today is completely 100% impractical, and that's because we're talking about how to grow crops on Mars. And if you've ever watched The Martian and if you thought, how did Matt Damon ever manage to grow potatoes? We'll talk about the science behind that, the theories, and what the current thinking is on how crops might be grown on Mars. If you've got any ideas, please comment. This is going to be a YouTube video as well as a podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube and you've never seen or listened to any of my podcasts, I've got over 200 episodes on a different hydroponic subject every single day of 2025, and they're all available on your podcast provider of choice, whether that's Apple, Spotify, Amazon, whatever, and they go from complete beginners all the way through to expert level. So today we're talking about potential of growing crops on Mars. I'm not going to cover how you would get astronauts from Earth to Mars and feed them there. I'm going to assume that's already been done. We're going to talk the practicalities of Mars specifically, not other planets, not space bases, not moon bases. And there's lots to unpack. It's going to be a real deep dive into that today. Okay, so the first thing, the most important thing for life, the reason Los Angeles is where Los Angeles is and Benidorm in Spain is where Benidorm is, it's not because they're great locations. It's because the most valuable resource in the world, on Earth, is there, and that's fresh water, clean water you can use for crops and for growing plants. And so that will be the first factor when looking for a location to cultivate plants on Mars. And there are some downsides because where the water is might not be the best place to grow plants. So if we think about the best locations, Mars has been found at the poles. However, you've got a trade-off there with the latitude. So a Mars year is extremely long. Look at my notes, 687 days. And I asked ChatGPT how many days a year at the poles is there enough light to maintain photosynthesis, to allow photosynthesis to occur, and that's 300 to 340 days. And so half the year there's not enough light for photosynthesis. So we're not likely to be growing with windowed based hydroponic systems there. So, but first of all, you're going to need the water. Can you mine it? Can you purify it? Can you recycle it? You might look for mid-latitude regions with shallow subsurface locations. There's one called Utopia planitia. So that might be a good location, and it's been detected by radar and neutron mapping that it has water. So it offers ice at diggable depths. So the Martian colonizers could get out there and dig. So it's not just the poles. The problem with the poles is, as I said, that you've got those brutal winters. Imagine an Antarctic base and then times it by 10. And you've got more stable light there. The seasons are more extreme on Mars as well. So the light levels differ by up to 40% based on season. There is potential, you could potentially have two bases. You could have one on the North Pole, one at the South Pole, and you could just flip between the two and always be in summer. A bit like what rich people do here in the UK and ever have in South Africa for the winter, or Australia. What a fantastic life. When it comes to the light and all the intricacies that come with light, it's not just having light that's important, it's the amount of light. So Mars, on average, gets about 43% of the light from the sun that we get here on Earth. The day length, the length of time is roughly similar. So a Martian sol, which is the equivalent of a day, is 24 hours and 39 minutes. So plants will be fine with that. The growth levels would be lower with that amount of light levels. Obviously, that winter time would be the plants would be dormant. So there's a big issue around how would we grow plants on Mars, and you probably wouldn't use sunlight to grow it directly through photosynthesis. If you look at a lot of the science fiction literature and films and things like this, they've often got windows in the colonies and things like this, but windows are fairly impractical. You think about the weight required for a reinforced window to survive the harsh Martian windstorms and dust storms. They get covered in dust as well. They'd have to be transported. They couldn't be 3D. You can't 3D print a window. It's made of silica. You can't yet, I don't think. And also, if you compare that to just using LED or whatever the next generation of lighting is, whatever is around when they colonize Mars, then you could just use a solar panel or probably more likely a nuclear reactor. A nuclear reactor to actually power the lighting system. So that would be far more practical. So it's more likely they're grown indoors using artificial lighting. Also, the factor to consider is that Mars has 2 moons. So any of those biodynamic hippie astronauts and colonizers would need to decide which moon to prune and sow and germinate on. That's a bit of a joke, obviously. Biodynamics is a load of nonsense, if you ask me. There's that option, and then there's the other option. Could you use artificial photosynthesis or electroagriculture? I talked about that briefly on another subject. It's where you convert CO2 and electricity into something called acetate, and you grow organisms with that acetate, sort of GM, genetically modified plants that can feed off this acetate. Can be grown in the dark or in just light levels in a colony. You don't need grow lights. It's very much at an early stage, this technology of using acetate as a carbon source, as a food source for plants. But it's something that I think one of the Musk brothers has looked at, or even Elon might even be looking at. So it's an area of interest, both in human consumption here on Earth and on Mars. So yeah, it's something to consider. I would imagine most researchers are looking at LED lighting though currently, and as well as plant growth, they look at the growth of yeasts, algae, and fungi as well as to grow food. A bonus idea: could you grow under ice? Ice can filter out damaged UV without while passing photosynthetically active radiation through, potentially creating a light well in some settings. It's still speculative. Not sure if this could be happening on Mars, but it's intriguing for polar regions. Perhaps you could build or you could spray an igloo and grow inside a hermetically sealed igloo. So that's something to consider. Life gives you lemons, make lemonade. If life gives you an extremely cold planet, then make an igloo to grow your crops in. So, obviously, the title of this podcast is Hydroponics Daily, and we focus on hydroponics. And you might think, well, do they have to grow hydroponically on Mars? Well, there's no soil on Mars, and that's because it might contain dust, but soil, by definition, is something that plants grow in. So on Mars, on the moon, there is no soil. There is something called regolith, and we could potentially use that as a grow media for hydroponics. Now, some sorts of hydroponic systems, you wouldn't require any grow media anyway, so you could do without the regolith. So deep water culture, where the roots are suspended in a rated nutrient solution, simple, stable, but water heavy, and could drive up the humidity in sealed habitats. Requires a lot of water, so if the Mars colonizers are going to struggle to get water out and clean it up and melt it, then potentially DWC is out of the question. Aeroponics is another option where roots hang in the air and then they're misted with nutrient solution using a mister or a fogger. Very water efficient compared to DWC, fast growth, but demands reliable nozzles, filtration, and redundancy. And in a Mars system, everything has to be fully reliable and bulletproof, because you don't want a sad ending to your Mars colony film, do you? So likely picks for me would be NFT, nutrient film technique, or probably ebb and flood, where you could fabricate channels and trays using 3D printers, and that would keep biofilms in check, and you could make fairly simple systems, and you could use the regolith as a growing medium for that. Also, when you think about hydroponic systems, obviously this is going to be fully controlled. for EC, pH, relative humidity, leaf temperature, VPD, light levels, nutrient dosing, and AI controlled systems, freeing up the colonizers to do other fancy things with their time, building out the habitation places and doing experiments with their scientists and things like this. So crew time would be precious and automation would be important. And you think about 3D printing manifolds, trays, spray rails, brackets, spares, feedstocks. Compare that to sort of transporting bulky finished hardware for years from Earth to Mars, trying to play sort of like 3D Tetris, trying to pack it all into a rocket. That would be virtually impossible. So it's probably going to be 3D printed, all of that. And then the big question when it comes to Mars colonization is, can the regolith become a growing media? So what does regolith offer? The sort of dust, the rock on Mars? Well, it's basaltic, like basalt rock, which means it's rich in magnesium, calcium, potassium, iron, and silicon. And there is also a location on Mars that's been found where nitrates, a key macronutrient, have been found. The Gale crater was found by NASA by one of the rovers, Curiosity rover, and so there's potential for using that. Now, that might not be the Gale crater might not be the best place for habitation, so there might not be water there, so you might need to go and quarry that and bring it back, things like that. That might be one of the missions on Mars. So those are five key elements there, plus nitrogen, but you're going to also have to add other nutrients that the regolith is short on. So phosphorus, sulfur, and all the macronutrients, like, apart from, what did I say? Iron, so boron, zinc, copper, molybdenum, manganese, etc. Chlorine, sodium, they wouldn't be an issue because humans will piss those out. And in a recirculatory water system, there'll be loads of those anyway. But it's also very thought to be porous, so that's a good thing for the regolith. Now, what are the downsides of the regolith? Well, there's one massive downside, and that contains perchlorites and other oxidants. These are compounds that are extreme oxidizing agents, and they will kill roots, plant roots, and they'll kill humans. And so they will need to be removed. They can be removed just by, if there was lots of water available and they found an easy way to remove it, to extract water on Mars, they could just leach that, just pour water through the regolith before they use it as a grow media. They could heat it to 200 to 400 degrees Celsius. So if you've got a nuclear reactor on site for lighting and heating and things like this, then potentially that could heat the regolith for that. Or if there's a hydrogen source, you could chemically reduce the oxidizing agents by adding hydrogen gas. Or you could use perchlorite reducing microbes in a bioreactor. And that's the basis of the plot of The Martian. Although it's not made super clear in it, Matt Damon is harvesting his feces and culturing it with the regolith to make the bacteria break down the perchlorite so that it's suitable for growth of the plants, and also for cycling nutrients as well. So it's mentioned in the book, perchlorites, but it's not mentioned in the film because it's go over most people's cinema goers' heads. But that would be one of the key things that would need to be looked at. Other disadvantages of regolith is it's got high pH, so between 8 and 9. It's got some aluminium in there, which are not great for plants. There's no organic carbon, and there's dust in there that could clog the roots. So they are minor disadvantages. And if you use a fertilizer like liquid gold, as I've said, we manufacture that, or gold leaf as it's known in the US, then there's no issues there because that will drag the sweet spot way down to between 5.5 and 6.5. The other advantage of using a fertilizer, like I said, like gold leaf, the unique one-part fertilizer, is that you don't need to worry about A and B fertilizers, and you don't need to be transporting pH up and pH down all the way from Earth. So I would definitely recommend NASA, when you colonize, get on the gold leaf, as it's called in the US, or liquid gold. If the UK Space Agency gets to Mars first, highly unlikely, but there you go. The other issue around the dust, I mentioned the dust there, that could block roots and block filters and things like this. Probably a bigger issue for HVAC systems, and if the dust got in, there's a lot of dust on Mars, and if you're breaking up regolith to make grow media, then that could be an issue. So you would need to wash and redust it. So there's an issue around magnetic issues around the grow media, but I'm not too sure about that. So we've talked about the regolith, the nutrients. So you want a reliable 1 part fertilizer. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be bulletproof. And we've tested our products on thousands, well, not thousands, hundreds of crops. So we know that it works. Or you could go, we talked about aeroponic NFT to remove the need for a substrate. Atmospheric management on the farm. So CO2, what's going to be your CO2 strategy? The crew will be exhaling CO2 and water, and you could take that and use that to feed the grow room, be scrubbed, or could be put into algal bioreactors as well. Or there's a high CO2 level on Mars, and so you could be using CO2 from the Mars itself. The oxygen levels are very, very low on Mars, so that's something we need to look at. And oxygen is required for germination. So even if you manage to get the plants to grow outside by some crazy GM feats, you would definitely need to bring them inside into a human habitation for germination, because seeds won't germinate without good levels of oxygen. What about humidity and condensation? Well, the humidity would be extremely low outside and could be very high inside. So heat recovery dehumidifiers to reclaim transpired water from both the humans and the plants. You want a near closed loop system there. And then thermals, one of the other, did I mention this when it came about the windows? Basically terrible insulation windows and poor physical strength. So you want heavy insulated to prevent on the habitat skin. The waste heat from the lights and gears could help heat the habitation. Your roots would need to be kept warm as well, so you couldn't just put them straight into regolith that's in the ground, because it would be freezing cold and your roots would get damaged. Just like when you situate a grow room in, say, like a greenhouse, and you heat the air in the greenhouse, but if it's really cold outside, the concrete floor can really damage the roots if you put them straight on it. So you might get a similar situation. What are you actually going to grow on Mars? Well, you want to grow fast, forgiving staple crops that provide lots of nutrients and lots of calories. That's going to be your first need. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, getting the calories in is the first thing, then getting the vitamins in would be the second need. So you're going to be looking at things like potatoes. Potatoes, you just put a seed potato in the regolith and eventually it'll grow and produce more potatoes. There's no need to think about flowering and fruiting and pollination. And it'll produce lots of calories fairly quickly. Whereas for nutrition and vitamins, then you're looking microgreens, culinary herbs and things like this that will produce lots of leafy greens, give you folic acid. And then in your hierarchy of needs, you go up to more like psychological requirements. You could feed yourself on potatoes and lettuce, but would you stay sane if you did that? So the other option for helping the colonizers stay sane and having an enjoyable time is letting them choose what crops they grow, and then letting them having some flavor as well. So things like strawberries, chives, mints, chilies, and tomatoes, things that they would recognize from home and give flavor to the plants rather than just being boring and bland. And then obviously, if you gave them a choice out of 10, then they feel like they've had a choice. It's psychologically having a choice on something is very important. Obviously, pollination, there's no insects on Mars. So you could use things like the colonizer's electric toothbrush or handheld vibration for pollinating certain crops like tomatoes and peppers, or just grow crops that don't require pollination. So lack of pollination is a bad thing. The good thing is that there's no pests or disease on Mars, but you need to make sure it stays that way. So that all the propagation material, the seeds or the seed potatoes, would need to be produced in a very, very sterile conditions for a number of life cycles before they go to Mars. You want menu diversity as well, so colonizers have a choice and a menu, as well as just a different choice of plants. And you might grow ornamentals, shade-tolerant ferns or flowering plants in the areas with lower light levels just to give a psychological effect. Some people say you don't need ornamental plants, but like Chairman Mao tried to get rid of all gardens in China during the Cultural Revolution, but then they find that plants have a important psychological effect, ornamental plants. There's lots of people in the UK who say, we should dig up council gardens and plant just food plants for people to eat. It's like some sort of utopia where people would just eat apples and the apples wouldn't just fall on the ground and get eaten by rats. Ornamental plants play a very important part, just like art and music. You wouldn't say, well, the Martian colonizers are not going to listen to music because it uses up valuable electricity. It's part of being human. And then you'd have to have crops that could be stored easily and robustly through the Martian winter. And potatoes is obviously great for that because they can be stored in the dark and in a wide variety of conditions. Or legumes and microalgae potentially. You could have bioreactors and things like this. So there's potential for that. Now, could you grow outside on Mars? That's a big question. There are lots of challenges to growing outside on Mars. I made a list. Where's my list? I can't find it. Lots of environmental killers. So there's almost no atmospheric pressure, so that could affect the plants. Extreme cold, so you could potentially genetically modify a plant to tolerate some of these factors. So extreme cold, desiccation, the complete lack of humidity, the oxidizing agents in the regolith. We talked about the perchlorites. Extremely high UV light because there's no real atmosphere there. Dust abrasion from the windstorms. The lack of water. Well, you would be adding water, otherwise the plants just wouldn't grow. Even a super plant would need to have lots of different factors stacked on top of it. A winter dormancy as well. That's another one. And so you very, very unlikely you could grow outdoors on Mars. However, as well as sort of GM crops, there's also the potential for terraforming Mars. You might have heard of nuke the poles, where this idea that you would send a load of rockets or missiles containing nuclear warheads and release them and set them off at the poles that could release CO2 to warm Mars and melt some ice caps. The snag there is there isn't enough accessible CO2 on Mars to meaningfully thicken the atmosphere with today's tech, even if you tried. So, but the idea would be that you just put hundreds of nuclear weapons and get rid of them, put them on Mars, somewhere safe, and by exploding them, and then eventually things like algae, microalgae could potentially grow, and then you could colonize thereafter. So that's something to consider. How would you power the farm? So we talked about nuclear fission and solar arrays, batteries, flywheel. There's a lot of storms there. You could have a wind farm, things like this. At the moment, LEDs, we said, are winning because of the precise spectra, high efficiency, dimmable, and photoperiodic control. But there might be a new technology by the time it comes to colonize Mars. Just jumping back into environmental controls, one thing that I think I missed is that you wouldn't need to have really high oxygen levels in the growing environment because plants don't need lots of oxygen when they're photosynthesizing. So potentially you could have two different habitats. You could have the habitat for the plants and the habitat for the humans. So this could mean that the Martian colonizers have to wear spacesuits or protective suits when they're harvesting and tending the plants, because why put all that energy into creating an oxygen-rich environment for the plants if it's not needed? It's only needed for the farmers. So they could wear spacesuits whilst they're harvesting it, and they could go into a different pod for living and sleeping and entertainment, and then have a separate pod for farming in, where it was 1,000 ppm CO2, but low levels of oxygen, and then only use the oxygen rich environment for the plants when they need to germinate some seeds and things like that. So there's potential there for some saving on habitat, environmental, highly energy intensive and resource intensive systems there. You don't need an oxygen rich environment. So how would you put that all together? Well, the site, probably not at the poles if you want a single site, mid-latitude where there's shallow ice. So that site called Utopia or the Arcadia zone could be a potential. However, you're still going to have a very long winter. So I would probably have two polar systems rather than just one. Structure, You could have it buried or a permed pressure hull. No windows, as we said, it's probably not going to be likely. Radiation shielding, and the regolith will help with that. Water wells and service corridors to separate the plants from the humans, because they want different things. Maybe an aeroponic system or an NFT system with cleaned regolith combined with a fertilizer. You could potentially use bioreactors to grow algae and fungi and yeasts and other things as well as plants. And obviously the inputs are the mined ice, power from the reactor, fertilizer like gold leaf, 1 part fertilizer, trace supplements, potentially CO2 from the crew or from outside, and then the outputs, leafy greens, potatoes. Leafy greens you could get daily, potatoes, potentially weekly after a while, and then other things like herbs and spices and things to flavor them afterwards, and then obviously some way of removing that perchlorate. But the key factor is going to be robustness. You don't want to have a story for a science fiction disaster movie playing out before you. You want to have robustness and probably fail-safes embedded into the system, because this is what there's no crew coming to rescue you. There's no reinforcements coming for years. Thanks very much for tuning in to Hydroponics Daily today. I've been your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, and as I say, this is a podcast that's available on a daily basis. If you are on Apple, please do leave us a review. It really helps us get hydroponics higher up on the gardening Apple charts. I want to get in the top 10 of gardening podcasts, and hopefully spread the word about hydroponics and its opportunities for the future of human crop cultivation. Thank you very much for listening. Until tomorrow, goodbye.